Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Nina Ernst and I'm the Associate Director of Programs here at Art Science Museum. Welcome to today's talk by Richard Hassell, who is one of the WOHA architects behind many of our favourite buildings here in Singapore. He's also the latest speaker in our online talk series, Feeling the Future. In a few minutes, I will hand over to Richard and we'll hear more about WOHA's project Strange Times. And after that, there'll be an opportunity for you to get involved. We hope that you will send us your questions and your comments via the comment section on Facebook and YouTube. If you just write away in those comments fields, then I will post the questions to Richard later. Before we launch in, I would like to offer a bit of context for today's program. We are coming to you today live from Art Science at Home, which since April has been sort of our new home, keeping the conversation with you going while Singapore has gone through its circuit breaker. One of the core programs in Art Science at Home has been this online talk series, Feeling the Future. And it has explored why and how we can possibly imagine new futures when the present is so uncertain and unsettling. Feeling the Future was originally intended to be a conference in the museum, connected with an exhibition called 2219 Futures Imagined. This exhibition tells the story of a world transformed by climate change 200 years from now, and it enables visitors to walk straight into that future. It includes works by nearly 30 artists and designers and writers and architects, both from Singapore and beyond, and they've all created immersive installations, theatrical sets, meditative spaces, and interactive artworks, film installations, that allow visitors to experience firsthand a number of possible futures. One of the artworks in the exhibition is an imagined newspaper, The Strange Times, which is a special commemorative paper edition published in November 2050. It imagines a moment of celebration as Singapore completes the CPR, the Coastal Protection Ring, which is a defense structure around the island to keep the future inhabitants of Singapore safe from rising sea levels. And this paper, The Strange Times, was conceived by the Singapore-based architectural practice WOHA, and that's of course why we're so delighted to welcome one of the co-founders of this practice with us here today, Richard Hassell. Hello, Richard. Before I hand over to you, I just want to say a few words of introduction. Richard Hassell is an Australian-born architect and artist who has lived here in Singapore since 1989. He founded WOHA with Wong Mun Summ in 1994, and since they've gained global recognition for their really special mix of environmental and social principles in their work. Their most awarded and recognizable projects here in Singapore, the WOHA Hotel Downtown, the School of the Arts, and of course the Park Royal in Pickering, are some of, part of our daily architecture and works that we're really excited about. But you could also look at developments like the Skyville at Dawson or Kampong Admiralty, and the latter in particular was a sort of prototype for WOHA for what an all-in-one city, a high-rise, could look like. It was named the World Building of the Year in 2018 as part of the World Architecture Festival. And it's a structure that includes everything that you can imagine in one: residential, elderly housing, medical facilities, bars and restaurants and cafes, social spaces, all with a tropical rainforest growing on the roof. And hopefully that gives you a sense of the wonderful ideas that comes out of the architectural practice. Now, alongside all of this amazing work, Richard also has time to serve as a board member on the Design Council Singapore, as part of the Board of Architects, and also as part of the Building and Construction Authority of Singapore. As if that wasn't enough, Richard, you're also an artist behind some really amazing works inspired by complex geometries and tiling. We are really excited to have you here today. Thank you for being here. And if you're ready, I'll leave the floor to you.
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you, Nina. I do have to clarify, some of those public duties have been over the last 20 years. I'm not doing them all right now. So what I'm sharing with you today is a PowerPoint that was part of presentation, which included the newspaper, The Strange Times, and a little film that we also have on exhibit in the Art Science Museum. And it was part of a conference in 2009, which had to imagine a positive future in 2050. And we thought this was really exciting to take part in because we love seeing other visions of the future. I think this is from something in the 1910s, I think, of a vision for a city of the future. I like the rollerblades and the pantaloons. And I think what it does show is that whatever we think of the future, we're normally wrong, but it's really interesting to speculate about where we think we're going and where we're going to end up. And as architects, we're quite familiar with a lot of visionary schemes. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's vision of the future of America from around the 1920s or 30s, I think, where everybody had a square mile of farmland and it was a distributed kind of agrarian society with these kind of drone vehicles that people flew around in. This is Le Corbusier's vision for modern life in France, and something that really influenced the way Singapore took shape. So you can see the green ground plane, elevated walkways and high-rise apartments here with an airship, because it was speculated about before the Hindenburg disaster. This is a really interesting project, a project for an inhabited bridge in New York by, I think it's Hugh Ferris is the artist who did this. And interestingly, Hugh Ferris was an artist who presented buildings for actual other architects. He was a renderer, but he also produced these imaginations of what New York could be. So this is a spectacular sort of apartment for thousands of apartments. That's also a new bridge over the Hudson to Manhattan. This is a view of the future from Archigram in the 1960s from London. So walking city, buildings that would actually walk around the earth and connect with these tubes to each other. And this is Kenzo Tangei's project for Tokyo Bay, which is actually something which has a structure very similar to the Art Science Museum, actually, as part of the design. Buckminster Fuller, who wanted to put his dome over an entire city and air condition it, something I think that was actually toyed with by Lee Kuan Yew for an idea of a fully air-conditioned Singapore. So we had to imagine for ourselves our own world in 2050, what it would be. So this is back in 2009. What's been a little bit scary is some of our sort of worst case scenarios seem to be the track that we're on now, actually. But in this world, we imagined that feedback systems accelerated global warming. So both Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets are melting. And these two areas of ice, if they fully melt, would rise the sea levels by 14 meters in 2100. And so by 2050, we would be about halfway there, but also imagining, the sea level is not a constant anymore. It's something that's going up every year. We imagine the climate would be about the same here on the equator, and the population is about the same at 5 million. But the world supply of food, energy, and water has peaked, so Singapore has to look at how it can survive on its own. So when we look at 14-meter sea level rise, it was actually quite scary. We lose all the reclaimed land that we've worked so hard to achieve, and most of the low-lying areas around the coast. And so obviously for Singapore, this would be a disaster. So we thought Singapore would have to protect its coastline, and we thought that could be possibly interesting. So we thought we won't panic. We'll think, how could solving this problem actually create a future that we might want to inhabit? And so we thought the sea, engaging with the sea is, something that we actually think is something quite nice. So can we fortify our coast at the same time as making it really enjoyable? And so our brief to our studio, and we did this studio with some great students from NUS. It was done over about a 6-week period, and we had to imagine that we were protecting the city fabric with the rising sea levels, that we had to shrink our footprint to the size of the island in terms of food, water, and energy, and that it couldn't be apocalyptic. It had to be fun and a great place to live. So here's some shots from the studio with our students. And after finishing it, we had many, many more things than I can show you today, but a whole range of schemes around the island based on the principles that I'm going to show you today. So we had a movie as part of the part of it, which you can see at the exhibition now the museum is open again, and the newspaper, of course. And the reason we did the newspaper, we thought it was really interesting to present this world that we're imagining in a high level of detail, and to also explain the scheme through this vision of daily life, rather than trying to always show it from the high level of a master plan. So the coastal protection ring, we imagine, is Singapore's scheme to close off the coast, but it was not to be a fortress, but a human-centered interface between land and sea. We actually developed like government documents. So we renamed the URA as the UIA, the Urban Integration Authority. And in typical fashion like they do now, they would be issuing guidelines for how people had to build around the coast. And actually we thought it was quite a fun thing to imagine, as Singapore already makes developers build the new roads and public infrastructure when they redevelop it, that the cunning idea is that Singapore would be redeveloped around the coastline, and so every private development would form part of this coastal protection ring. And as part of this document, we had to imagine what people were designing for. So we imagined that there's this series of levels that you have to design for as the sea goes up, and peaking by 14 meters at 2100. But by this, after the time we've sort of run out of fossil fuels and everything is super green, that then it would start to reverse and the sea levels go back down again by 2200. And so it was a really interesting design plan to think about the sea coming up and then slowly coming down again. And so we thought, how do we solve this? So we thought a nice concept is to think of old ground level, basically, and new ground level. And so the new ground level is a virtual ground level where you don't invest anything below that because it could get flooded sometime in the future. So the city basically starts fresh with thinking of all sorts of connections and infrastructure at new ground level. And that the beach is the eventual submersion design concept, so the ESDC. And so you have to demonstrate to the UIA how your coastline will function with these different heights of the sea. So at every stage, it's enjoyable. And so sort of the basic concept, we thought we took a key from how they protect cruise ships and things, where you actually have the ship, so if it gets a hole punched in it, it'll only flood part of the ship, the whole ship won't sink. So creating these compartments that are safe. And so there's basically like a double wall around the coast that's divided into compartments. So that way, even if there was something like terrorism or some sort of accident or damage, you wouldn't flood the whole island if there was a breach. And then we could think of how we would make this protection something really enjoyable. So we could make a beach on the seaside of it. There could be fish farms and other things inside. And we thought the best way to make sure it's not leaking is to fill it up with water. So Singapore's water problem could also be solved by having this perimeter dam all around the island as well. And there's an interesting problem too, because when you're below sea level, you enter the problem of Holland, where they need windmills and things to constantly pump the water up and get rid of it at a higher level. So we thought this new ground level could be really interesting, that everything collecting water like a tall building would discharge the water into these aqueducts that would be all at new ground level. And they could duct the water to the central reservoir or these tanks all the way around the edge of Singapore. And so we try and keep as much water as possible out of. So we thought things like the MRT made more sense to raise it up above this level. The buildings would start to have entrances at new ground level, 14 meters above the ground. And so basically the whole island has this double ground level, the old ground level, which is historical and interesting, and the new ground level, which is a whole lot of viaducts and aqueducts and new kinds of buildings. And then we thought on top of this sort of artificial rain tree, which held the MRT and bicycle and pedestrian lanes, we could have this massive solar energy canopy over it, which would harvest a lot of the energy for the island as well. And so there, in the newspaper, you can see views of these areas of Singapore, so these elevated solar energy covered public infrastructure and parks. And we thought the aqueducts could be really cool because they would sort of bring water from all the way through Singapore. So it's the sort of thing you could kayak to work on your elevated aqueduct as a new mode of transportation. And so we also thought, in order to investigate different ideas, we made a master plan for the whole island of Singapore and look at each part of Singapore as having a different character, really just for the sake of exploring different ideas. So we wanted to increase agricultural productivity as well as energy productivity so we could feed ourselves. And so we had to shrink this footprint, which is currently, we need 20 Singapores to feed Singapore. With this, we realized you can't program the island just two-dimensionally anymore. So to say something like Jurong is an industrial district doesn't make sense. It has to be doing many things at many levels to be able to achieve this goal. So what we did, we looked at the current master plan where you can see like different uses occupy different parts of the island. And we thought it'd be interesting if we then expand all of them to the size they need to be. So you see that, you know, agriculture covers almost all of the island, residential needs to as well. And sort of see it as a three-dimensional set of requirements over each piece of land where it has to operate at a very high efficiency in terms of generating energy, generating food. So we did another sort of official document for what this future would look like with a sale site. And these are actually part of the newspaper that Nina showed you as well in terms of advertisements for a site that's being sold under these conditions. And as we go, I mean, it's probably a little small to see on the screen, but we zoom in. We looked at all kinds of things we think are going to be important in the future, like waste is no longer a problem to get rid of. You know, waste is actually a lot of energy potential and nutrient potential. So who owns it? Who gets to keep it? That every site would have to have a designed ecosystem in it, and that you would have to have a nominated animal or bird that you looked after on your site. And we had this idea that the happiness index would be a mandatory requirement, so that you had to ensure that all your residents were very, very happy with their lot in life. So that sort of gives you the overall structure. And we did this map showing some different areas of Singapore, and as I said, each one let us explore a different idea. So the first one at the top we allocated as Sun City. So this is an area that had to perform very well for solar. And so we thought it would be interesting if we could turn the whole district into a giant solar array, a solar farm, which would reflect sunlight onto a solar energy tower. And this would have a massive steam generator that from all this energy would create a huge amount of energy through these turbines. And so we saw this as retrofitting over the area to turn the whole district into a solar dish. What was fun about the future too, we thought we don't really need to care too much about cool aesthetics. We could just sort of assume in the future people had different tastes. And so whereas we're normally sort of trying to design things that look very beautiful and elegant, in this case we thought, who knows in the future what people think. And here we had an idea. At that time, 2009, like ringtones were a big thing on people's phones and downloading custom ringtones. And so we thought here they could be customizable solar panels. So as a building, people could choose how you could digitally alter the facade of your HDB through this retrofit of solar panels. On the northwest corner, we thought it would be interesting to investigate tidal power. And this is something where we noticed Singapore has quite high tides of a couple of meters every day. And this is in the northwest of Australia, there's this area called the horizontal waterfalls where the tide has to get in and out of some estuaries through very narrow openings, and it creates this very powerful current at that point. And so we thought, okay, maybe in this part of Singapore we could build a series of really interesting bays where the tide has to come in through the opening, and we have energy generators at those points. So this is in more of the forested and army reserve areas around there, and we thought it could become a sort of quite a romantic getaway area where you could live in an apartment around this beautiful bay and watch the tides go in and out. On the east coast, we thought it's got a sort of high-end leisure activity, and so we thought, actually, it's for a man-made coastline, it's quite efficient from an engineering point of view, but it's not very interesting. So we thought, well, if we have a chance to remake a coastline, we could make it a lot more fun. Maybe something like Phuket with headlands and beaches and things. And so these buildings, which form the ring, become high-end apartments, which are sort of embedded in these mountains, and other ones floating above. And in this one, we had an idea that the building itself could generate its own moisture through sort of creating a cloud with chilled water pipes in it, and then collecting the condensation. So this development, we called it the Cloud and Mountain. And you can see here how the apartments straddle the seawall and create fantastic waterfront apartments for everybody. Jurong, we thought was interesting to try and solve the food problem because it's mainly a fairly low-rise area. And so what we thought could be fun was to see it as an industrial area that's also a farming area. So to sort of bury what's there now under Ubud, basically. And we thought Ubud's really interesting because it looks like a beautiful natural landscape, but actually every single plant that you see in this photo is a food plant or a useful plant. So you see bananas and rice and coconuts, and the trees in the background are jackfruit and durian and chocolate and tobacco. So we thought it could be very nice to have this sort of beautiful district. And so we looked at the industrial zone below, what that would be doing, and then an agricultural zone on top. And that this would create this artificial landscape that would be generating all the food that we need in Singapore, and with wind generators that are specially designed for Singapore's low winds on top. And that these could actually be very beautiful sort of lifestyle houses where people could enjoy living among the rice fields, despite the fact there's a sort of giant wafer factory right underneath their house that's contributing to Singapore's GDP. So the sort of gentleman farmer who retires here and plants rice in the morning and swims in the pool in the afternoon. So the network of aqueducts and viaducts would transfer water and everything, as I said, at the new ground level back to the higher reservoirs inside. We would also have farming. So as we imagined everyone having to move to the coast to build the coastal protection ring and live on the coast, the inner HDBs could be repurposed as high-rise farms. And so these would have trees and fruit trees on the roof, LED veggies going down below. The farmers with the pH were where there would be genetically modified organisms that would also be producing Singapore's pharmaceuticals and healthy food. And then below that, livestock, chickens and pigs, and then finally fish farms at the bottom. So all this is in the newspaper, so I do encourage you to get down to the museum to take a read of it. And we have many things in it too, advertisements for travel in these days, and we thought airships might make a comeback in a low energy environment, so they're drifting around slowly in the sky. We had new companies, so we took Nestle and turned it into algae, and we were imagining a whole series of algae products with this rather disgusting logo of a nest full of algae. We had recipes for cooking with the algae and these genetically modified foods. We thought mushrooms, genetically modified mushrooms, would be a great use of all the basement car parks in Singapore, which would no longer be necessary. So we were imagining mushrooms that were engineered to produce a whole lot more chemicals. We had this personal air conditioning where you could strap these wings, which would give you a greater heat dispersal mechanism plugged into your lymph system or your blood system, with some amusing reviews of them. These are the downloadable LED patterns for your HDB. New jobs that would come about because of all these new things. And we thought with our reliance on nature for energy, that the weather forecast would become an energy forecast where you could actually see how much your condo would be harvesting and whether you would be able to sell any to the grid and make some money. So sort of combination of stock market and weather report. Yeah, so these are just some of the new jobs that we could foresee. And we had a timeline in it for how Singapore would achieve this. What's really scary is we're already up to the bottom left in terms of our time. So from the 2009, it's been about 12 years. And what's scary is we haven't really moved very fast towards any of these solutions during that time. So this timeline does really give me a bit of a panicky feeling after saying don't panic. I'm starting to panic about whether we're going to get to the future that we need to in order to survive. And so that's the end.
Thank you, Richard. That was amazing. Really fascinating to see. And I personally love that there's a mandatory happiness index. I think just go ahead and implement that straight away. Everyone, we're live on YouTube and Facebook right now. This is your chance to ask questions about the future that Richard might or might not answer. So do please write your comments and your questions in the fields below, and then we will filter them through to Richard. Richard, it's an enormous project, right? I mean, there's a lot of detail in every slide that you've shown us today. I just wondered, like, how does an architectural practice get to a point where they sit down and write a newspaper? How was that process? What happened there?
Actually, it went really quickly. We did have all the students, so we had quite a big team for a short amount of time. But there were issues that we were really interested in just from our everyday job. So I think we didn't have to do a lot of the research. I mean, some of the numerical research, like how much farms we need to get the students to work on calculating that. But it was sort of a great relief in a way, because it's something I've been researching for many years but hadn't had the opportunity to put it together. And so it poured out of us, really. And it was a really great team. Shirin from our office, she has a husband who's really into sci-fi, and so he was sort of jumping in and telling her all kinds of things. And we were looking at Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the character Slavy Bartfast, who designed Norway's fjords and things and won an award for it. So it was a sort of a great moment to roam across all these different things we were interested in and put something together. And then interestingly, it's actually formed the basis for a lot of our serious professional work subsequently, and things like Kampong Admiralty that you mentioned actually have many elements that are based in this project that we did.
About putting people first, or making room for that fun way of life, perhaps.
Yes, and about stacking things up, saying something can't just be elderly housing, it has to be elderly housing and a park and a public space and a hawker centre and a medical centre. So that idea that the more you can combine things and the more exciting the proximity and the more opportunities and for different sort of moments and lifestyle events you can create in one development.
Amazing. I mean, I think it's clear that it was probably a fun thing to put together for everyone involved. And we have a question from the floor from Stephen on this. He's saying, this future seems so fun. Speculative fiction is often quite grim. And he wonders, how important do you think the role of fun is in imagining the future?
Well, that was really important to us because we thought, firstly, it was part of a design conference. And I think design, you must have a very positive attitude towards the future. There's no point designing an awful future. So I think, and in fact, some of the students struggled with this because there's a great attraction to apocalyptic futures, I think, and they're much more dramatic and exciting. there's the saying drama is created by conflict. So somehow if you design out conflict, you in a way have a very undramatic future, which might be very pleasant, but it's not exciting to look at. So we thought fun in a way can take the place of that. Instead of conflict, we're showing fun, and in a way, humor kind of ups the emotional engagement, I guess, with it. But it is, as a practice, we try and stay humorous and lighthearted, because I think if we can design lighthearted environments, I think it's better than serious, pretentious environments or angry, stressed out environments, you know. So I think fun implies a level of ease and comfort, and that the basic things are taken care of, and it's about community and engaging with people. So I think fun is a great attitude for design.
I mean, you said something there around how you can't design for a dark future. You have to look towards a positive solution, which I think is really interesting. And it's interesting also in relation to some of the other works that Strange Time is sitting up against in the exhibition, because you're thinking like that, because probably you're an architect. And so your vision is a practical solution to a number of problems, I wonder. Whereas, of course, in the exhibition in 2219, Strange Times is one of many artworks, one of many visions of the future. Some of them are from filmmakers, as I mentioned, or visual artists or installations, and they all have different ways of imagining the future. Do you think that architects go about thinking about the future in a different way to other creatives?
I think so. Well, I guess probably not compared to other designers, but in terms of cultural practice, I think art and movies and literature, they are much more able to go to the dark side, because what they're trying to evoke is an emotional reaction in the viewer, or to engage in it. And so a work of art could be a warning or a requiem, or a process of grieving for something we're going to lose, but it's not a useful attitude for design. And I remember we had one student, and she wanted to have these homeless people who were trapped beneath the rising waters, living like troglodytes on the outside of the wall, which was interesting from an artistic point of view. But we kept saying to her, but what are you going to design? Because the act of designing for these poor people is, the first act you would do is just take them out of that situation, and not design them a sad, wet, oil slicked hovel at the side of the sea. So I think it's about, design is a positive action, I think.
Yeah, there's an element of care in what you're doing.
Yes.
And we've got a question from Emma. She's saying, how do you see all of these ideas fit into Singapore's future vision of becoming city in nature?
Yeah, well, I think it is, as I showed in some of those things like the sail site things, we saw this attitude of care for ecosystems, and the idea that the only way to preserve nature now is to design for it. And particularly in Singapore, where we don't have a hinterland, anything that's nature in Singapore is because it's nature on the master plan, and it's been ring fenced. And so I think so moving from just simply ring fencing it and protecting it, then you get the thing like, can we expand that back out through the city? Can we add that as another layer that runs through everything we're doing? And interestingly, in the 12 years or 11 years since we did this exercise, we've sort of codified that and found that people are immensely excited by it. And I think, things that are not at the moment produced through intent, like the otters in Singapore, create a lot of excitement. The hornbirds, were done by providing the nest boxes because there weren't enough old trees in Singapore. So through a small intervention like creating a nest box. And so you start seeing by very small design decisions, simply by considering nature your client or your end user group or a stakeholder, with thinking that you can really make great changes. And so I mean, the moment we're working on a park connector with NParks, and we've put into our brief that we're also connecting animal habitats as well as people connecting through the park, and seeing what simple moves we can make to facilitate animal movement so they can get to all the trees. You know, they don't try and run across the road to get to the trees. And we're finding that really is another hopeful and fun and exciting layer to master planning and architecture.
Beautiful. I mean, having nature as your client should be the mantra for every new young architect, surely. I think that's just wonderful. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to throw them at you, Richard. I hope you're ready. Are you aware of what Singapore is actually planning on doing to combat rising sea levels, or are they planning anything that you propose? We
did actually, interesting, present a very similar presentation to the one I made today, a bit longer to them. We were contacted after the exhibition to say, could we share it? Because there is, obviously Singapore is looking at these issues. It was a rather strange meeting because we had sort of representatives of 12 different departments that are all on an interdepartmental panel. And they obviously are very serious engineers and things looking at it. So the slightly humorous content was difficult for them to understand, like, were we being serious or was it just meant to be funny? And we were saying, well, it's actually both, but there's a lot of interesting ideas in here. And they were going, and how many people were working on this? And we said, oh, you know, we had 12 students and 3 people from our office. And how long were you working on it? Oh, 6 weeks. And they were sort of, so they were, the whole thing was a little bit odd for them, you know, because we'd made a lot of assumptions. We didn't have some things based in data because we couldn't get it in time. But they took it away. And so who knows whether some of these ideas have affected policy or not. But I do know they're looking at it very seriously. And, you know, just in normal developments, they keep raising the flood protection levels in Singapore. You notice whenever you go into an MRT that it's always raised up a metre or so. But I think some of the projections are really dire, like the 14 metres, and they unfortunately seem to be coming true. Like all the worst case scenarios we imagined in 2009, we're right on track for them, I think, at the moment. So it's kind of scary.
Yeah, I mean, we have some questions coming in on sustainable solutions. I just want to comment that I think it's really interesting that humour, perhaps in the museum, helps people understand your vision of the future without it seeming alien or too scary. But when you're talking to government, the humour perhaps gets in the way or is confusing. That's interesting that the same ideas can be presented so differently. We've got a question from Honor. She's saying, Richard, your vision of the future Singapore is extraordinary and inspirational. What are some of the constraints in moving towards some of these sustainable solutions?
It's actually, I would say it's inertia, institutional inertia. Everybody kind of knows these things are happening, but everyone's unsure as to the certainty and how much to invest in them. And how much it's a sort of chicken and egg thing, you know, if everyone else isn't doing it, then why are you doing it? So I do think of all places in the world, Singapore is probably very well placed because in terms of whole of government approach and agencies working together, there's a much greater chance here, and plus the problem is sort of small and contained. I was in another conference looking at Bangkok, and they've got a massive coastline on the delta of the river, which is all very close to sea level. And to imagine, you know, the cost of trying to protect Bangkok from the sea is incredible compared to Singapore. So I think, you know, a bit like solving water, as Singapore has been doing, if there's a bit more of an impetus, which is difficult, to start investing public funds in these things, I think, you know, Singapore could be a world leader in how to address some of these issues, and it would be very good for, you know, export of services and expertise, a bit like Holland is already for below sea level living. I do feel it's, you know, until the public are clamouring the government to say do something, it's very hard for them. It's not a sort of electorally popular thing. If you say more parks or more hospitals, people can see an immediate benefit. But if you say in 70 years, this will be underwater, it's much cheaper to do something about it now. There's still a lot of debate as to, are you sure we should be investing in that instead of hospitals? So it's tricky, I think. But I feel like we're reaching a tipping point, and interestingly, I think COVID has changed a lot of mindsets about inertia. Suddenly everything's been disrupted, and people can't travel. It was unthinkable in January. And I remember when Wuhan locked down, everyone went, "Oh, that could only happen in China." No one, the rest of the world will never lock down. And then before we knew it, we were all at home in our pajamas with a cup of Milo doing our work.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, because obviously this project here looks to what's now 30 years in the future. And some of the master plans I'm sure that you're looking at looks way beyond that, to more distant futures. The 2219 spans 200 years. And so maybe at the point where we are getting used to looking further afield, suddenly we're snapped back to something which is about the here and now with COVID-19, right? And we're having to make instant changes to the way that we live in a city, to the way that we live with each other. And how does that affect architects like you? How do you change the way you think about the future with something like this happening?
I think, it's as every week goes on and we realize how much longer it's going to affect us. I think it's moving more into an urban design and architectural timeframe. Our projects, typically take minimum 5 years and maybe 8 or 10 years. So in some respects, when you're looking at that time scale, you're thinking, well, COVID's probably well over by then. But I think it's been such a transformative experience. People are looking at the swine flu, when's the next one coming? And I think with our disrupted ecosystems and climate, the predictions are these are going to happen more often. I think, if you look at the last one, major one, 1918 to 2020, as a once in 100-year thing, it's quite hard to plan for, a bit like the global warming. But if we're imagining every 15 or 20 years or, that sort of timescale, then you have to make real changes, I think, to the way people go about their daily lives. So it's still playing out. I think people are getting used to the idea. They're trying to figure out how much they have to change things permanently and how much short term. I think like small things like touch-free technology for lifts and things will probably come in, because I don't think it's difficult. It'll just be seen as sensible. Things about density and whether it's sensible for 1,000 people, 1,000 families to live in one building. I think those questions will take a little bit longer to answer. And it's not so obvious too, because I think Hong Kong and Singapore haven't seen a lot of transmission within buildings, even though the densities are high. But in many cities around the world, they're saying this is the end of high rise. Yeah, could be the end of commercial downtowns, I think, and business travel.
I mean, so there's a number of questions here from the floor, and I sense there's a little bit of a concern about space in the future. Will we have enough space? Is it really right that we would be cramming lots of chickens into a high-rise building? Are you worried about our space planning in the future?
Not really. I mean, we weren't anticipating a major population increase, so I think it's a matter of, at the moment, the people we have in Singapore now redistributing them to suit these new requirements. And in fact, if you've made a sort of linear city like we're suggesting around the coast, that actually opens up the middle of Singapore to be much more varied in density and amount of humans. And so I think you can design for loneliness and open spaces and interestingly, our Sky Villa Dawson project with all its community gardens, it's quite possible to find an area there where you can be alone with a book and not see somebody, even though there's 960 apartments in the development. So I think, again, it's a bit like the animals as your clients. If we take it on board that we need lonely spaces in Singapore and quiet spaces, and not everything being sort of designed to the same level of activity and intensity, I think it's quite possible to not feel claustrophobic on a small island.
There's also a question about permaculture as a solution. Besides the URA or the UIA and the rising sea levels, what other limitations was considered to produce this positive solution? Was permaculture?
When we looked at productivity, like to use, the problem with permaculture in the traditional sense is it's quite land intensive. So for Singapore, it's a little bit of a problem if we want to do it. So we thought we had to look at more high tech versions. But I think a lot of the concepts behind permaculture in terms of not using pesticides, about using species that enhance each other's growth or performance, using natural systems to achieve ends. I think a lot of the aspects of permaculture could be made as a hybrid with some more frightening aspects, like maybe genetic modification, to create a sort of future that was very chemical free, but maybe had the kind of productivity we need to support 5 million people off only 600 kilometers of land. I think, I mean, again, in the future, people panic because they go, I don't want to live like that. I don't want to do that. And I think the main takeaway we were trying to have with it is, like, if everywhere in the world is experiencing problems, Singapore may not be able to rely on friendly external parties to send us beef and, organic vegetables from rural Australia. Maybe they're saying we need this all for ourselves, or maybe Russia's paying twice as much as Singapore can afford it. We can't get them. So we thought, once you have basic security, you can then add over that the layers of trade and exchange and more varied produce and ways of doing it. But you can always fall back in the case of an emergency on being able to feed your population.
And I guess, I mean, one of the inevitable things about the future is that we will have to change, and that change might not be comfortable. Change isn't always comfortable. One of the questions here is asking, how can government agencies engage with the public to really push these solutions forward, which is an interesting.
Yeah, I think, well, that's in fact one positive outcome of this exercise, I think, is if you can show a solution where the problems are solved, but it's not all about you have to change and you're going to have to give up this and you're going to do something else. We say, well, life in 2050 would be different. You will be living on the coast with your private beach, looking after your dugong colony as part of your biological thing. You would have a fish farm in between the things, and you will be able to kayak to work. I think by framing it as a different place, but that has a whole lot of really exciting new experiences and ways to live, and some of them will sound better than what we have now, and some might sound different. But I think if we just see it as a sad future where we've lost half the things we love today, then it's going to be really hard to build consensus. And I do think sort of for governments, they have to build a consensus vision of the future. It has to be probably very diverse and cater to all kinds of people. But it has to be positive, and it has to be something people feel comfortable moving towards. Or I think they do retreat into nostalgia and resistance and despair, really, because it just seems to be a future of loss.
Yeah. Lots of questions here. There's a question which is really, I suppose, getting to the core of that, the personal impact on me and how the future would feel different. How does the plan align with concepts of a 15-minute city where work, school, home, and everything lies within a 15-minute commute?
I think it could totally incorporate that. That's a matter of distributing those elements within that distance. And the central sort of concept of the master plan was that you have to stack these things up. So I think by doing that, you can then place things in the right kind of adjacencies and congruency. There's no need to travel to the central business district, or visit a factory out at Jurong if there's manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing is distributed and schools are around. It should be very possible to make a walking or kayaking.
Oh, yeah, that's super fine. That's amazing. I mean, it's almost the opposite problem, right? With, if we're stacking everything, it's how do we clock up 50 minutes of a commute if it's just about traveling upwards a couple of floors?
Yes, I mean, Kampong Admiralty is like that. It's like you can't get your 10,000 steps in because you can get everything within about 20 meters.
I was worrying about that. Very good, you've solved it. Okay. There's a couple of questions about the near future for you guys, for WOHA, whether you can give us a sneak peek into what you are working on now and what's coming next for WOHA in Singapore.
Okay. Yes, a few things. We've been working in the north of the island at the Pongo Digital District and with the SIT University. So that's really exciting because we master planned the area and we've been able to implement some of the developments there as part of this vision of the future. So I think when that's finished, hopefully it's a little fragment of this. It has, we've preserved a forest. We're looking at the farming and the energy. It's a walking and cycling district. So I think it gives a little bit of maybe a hopeful vision of the direction that we'd like to move in. As I said, we're doing some park connector project with NParks, looking at that whole human nature integrated client. So that's fun and exciting. We've just been awarded something down by the Art Museum, which there'll be some details of that coming out in a few weeks. So yeah, we feel like we always like to see our projects as prototypes for the future. They address hopeful and fun ways of existing that's still addressing the major problems of our time, like sustainability and community. And so, yeah, I think coming up, there'll be some interesting projects.
There's a question about, and it's quite interesting on the back of some of the slides you've shown us, and almost on the back of some of those early 20th century visions of the future, which were very funny to look at. What aspects of the future are you most excited about when you think about the future of architecture?
I think I'm actually interested in how solving these problems actually create new kinds of buildings and urban spaces. And I was looking at something on one of my duties yesterday, which is some of these new, very large MRT stations that are elevated in the city. I think there's all kinds of sort of new buildings that we don't know what they're meant to look like. And I think that's very exciting from a design point of view. Like, we all know what a podium and a tower looks like, and then it becomes actually, I find, a little bit boring as an architect to say, are we going to do a curtain wall? Are we going to do a sunshade? But it's really styling up objects that we know and in fact have been around for coming up to 70 years. So to me, what's really exciting about these ideas that there's new kinds of infrastructure we need. There's new ways of integrating with that, the infrastructure in the city, because we no longer can afford to just give big chunks of the island away just to infrastructure. So I think it's really exciting when you don't know what something's going to look like or what it's going to, how it will feel to be there. I think that's where you're at a stage where design is really open, and you can surprise yourself with what comes out of it. So I find that very exciting.
I'm not sure whether I imagined it in your slides, whether there was a sort of stylistic nod to those early images from the early 20th century when we saw the Sun City. It looked like something out of Metropolis, or it had that kind of slightly retro throwback feeling. There's a question about the comeback of old architectural ideas, whether you think ideas are recycling in the future. They're saying, do you think old architectural ideas, the fun palace, plug-in city, metabolism, can make a comeback, looking at also the restrictions we have around flexibility of space?
Yeah, I think a lot of them are, because a lot of the visionaries of the 20th century actually were imagining probably conditions in the world more like we have now in terms of population numbers and technologies that weren't available then. So I think people are starting to look at those ideas again as embedding some useful design research, which we can use now. I think the difference is there's a really beautiful essay by Stephen Jay Gould called Time's Arrow, Time's Cycle. So there's aspects of cycles in time, but there's an arrow that we can never go back. So ideas come back, but the next time they come back in a slightly different form. I mean, you see this in art as well, something like op art, that there's a resurgence of interest in many aspects of that, but it's not the same as it was in the 60s. It's come back, and somehow through the passage of time, changes in society, changes in knowledge, they need to be done in a different way.
Well, I think we've had lots of exciting thoughts and lots of exciting food for thoughts. Even some reading lists there for you on in the last question. So I really want to thank you, Richard, for taking the time to walk us through your beautiful and inspirational vision of the future today. To all of you who've tuned in today, thank you so much. And if you haven't been down to see Strange Times in the exhibition, please come down, because it's a really beautiful project to spend a bit of time with. Thank you, Richard, so much, and thank you everyone who tuned in. Do come back and listen to some of the previous talk in the Feeling the Future series, or come back for our grand finale in 2 weeks when we hear from Tong Yi, the co-founder of Thought Collective, for our last talk in the series. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks, Nina.